It was the kind of afternoon Oxford wears best, rain feathering down the gutters, pooling in the uneven cobbles, a city shrinking into its own collar. I'd been at home with a Rioja that had promised much on the label and, for once, delivered more in the glass. The Times crossword lay splayed before me, the ink beginning to blur where a careless hand had met the damp ring from my glass. Cradle's echo, 5 letters. It lingered like a faint itch in the mind. I had no reason to be at the King's Arms that evening, other than the weather's knack for making my rooms feel smaller than they were. It was there, somewhere between the second and third pint, that I overheard Harding, the bookseller from the High, holding forth to anyone within earshot. His voice had the slightly theatrical cadence of a man unaccustomed to an audience but determined to keep it. He had been walking down Canning Lane in the rain when he swore he heard a baby laughing from the upper floor of the abandoned Georgian house at the corner. It was not just a laugh, he insisted, but the kind that comes in little fits, sudden, unguarded. A sound of pleasure, not distress. He had stopped, half expecting to see a curtain stir, but the windows were blind with dust. The place, everyone knew, had been empty for years. Harding's tale met with the kind of indulgent skepticism the English reserve for anything outside their own experience. Someone muttered about foxes, another about the wind in the chimneys. I might have let it pass, and did until the following morning. The Oxford Mail had tucked the item in the lower column of page 3. Woman found dead in Canning Lane house. No name yet, no details beyond the bare fact of it. The rain that morning seemed colder, sharper, as if it had been filtered through the stone of the Bodleian itself. I had no formal summons. It was Lewis who rang. A body, he said, in the same house. His voice had that slight hesitation, the one he used when the facts he had were insufficient but troubling. I looked at the Rioja, still half a bottle left, and felt the quiet resistance of a man being called away from a rare, private hour. The walk through Oxford to the station took me past the familiar markers of my professional life. A second-hand bookshop with its damp smell of foxed pages, the covered market where the butchers stood idle, hands deep in pockets, the library windows clouded with condensation, shapes moving dimly behind them. Every place seemed to be holding its breath. At the corner of Canning Lane, the house stood apart from its neighbors, as though it had been left behind in a slow retreat. The rain had painted its bricks a darker shade of memory. Lewis was waiting under the eaves, his hair plastered to his head. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of long neglect. Dust, plaster, something faintly metallic. Floorboards creaked as if protesting the intrusion. The drawing room held the body, a woman, perhaps in her 50s, lying as though she had once been standing very straight and then forgotten to remain so. The face was turned away. I noticed, on the mantelpiece, a silver rattle, unblemished, untouched by the dust that lay over everything else. Lewis said something about the coroner's estimate, but I was already elsewhere in my thoughts. Back outside, the rain slackened to a mist. I thought again of Harding's account, the laugh in the darkness, and of the crossword clue, Cradle's echo. I had not yet solved it, but the shape of the answer was beginning to form at the edges, like a face glimpsed through misted glass. Something, I felt, had already spoken to me from that house, though I had not yet understood the language. I told Lewis we'd begin in the morning. That night, the Rioja remained unopened on the table, the crossword unfinished. Some sounds, I've learned, will not leave you. The key turned reluctantly in the swollen wood, and the front door yielded with a sigh, as though it had been holding the weather out for decades and was weary of the effort. Lewis went in first, his tread heavier than mine, disturbing the air in that way younger men do, as if space were merely something to be occupied rather than considered. Inside, the smell was the first thing. Not the sharpness of rot, but the dulled, resigned odor of plaster and fabric slowly surrendering to damp. Wallpaper the color of old bone curled away from the walls, its edges frilled like burnt paper. The hall was narrow, choked with shadow. It felt less like entering a house than stepping into someone else's paws. We found her in the drawing room, Caroline Fenton, as the neighbor had finally supplied through a half-open door across the street. A woman past her first youth, but still holding the remnants of a face that must once have caught the eye in a crowded room. She lay on her side, the tilt of her head making the angle of the neck seem wrong, though the skin at her mouth suggested neither struggle nor peace. Lewis muttered something about a fall from the stairs, pointing to the worn curve of the banister above. I knelt beside the body, my knees complaining as they always do now, and noticed the dust patterns on the carpet. One set of marks where something had been dragged aside, a chair perhaps, and replaced. I did not comment. The mantelpiece drew me. Everything else in that room wore the dull coat of months, years perhaps, without attention, but there, gleaming faintly even in the weak morning light, lay a silver rattle, the sort given to a child whose parents read the Times rather than the Mirror. Its surface bore no fingerprint smears, no misting of neglect. Either it had been placed there very recently, or someone had made a point of preserving it. Both possibilities seemed equally absurd. We moved from room to room. The furniture remained in place, as though waiting for an owner delayed by a matter of hours rather than decades. A music stand in one corner still held a brittle sheet of Schubert, the paper foxed but the ink stubbornly black. The kitchen sink bore the ring of an old teacup, the cup itself still on the side, handle missing. From the garden door, a woman in a wool coat was visible at the fence, pretending to adjust her scarf. Lewis, ever the diplomat, went out to her. I watched through the warped glass as she leaned in, speaking low. Later, he told me she'd mentioned seeing lights upstairs some nights, hearing music that stopped when she tried to locate it. Once, she said, she thought she heard laughter, a child's perhaps, but she had been half asleep and it was raining. While Lewis occupied her, I bent to pick up something from under a chair near the fireplace. A scrap of paper, the torn edge jagged, the writing not quite legible in places. A poem. I recognized the rhythm before the words. The hand was small, precise, the kind one associates with women of a certain schooling. I could not place it, though I felt sure I had read the lines before, perhaps in a volume borrowed and never returned. I slipped it into my pocket without remark. There are moments in an investigation when sharing a thing too early allows it to dissolve in the air between you, losing whatever strange gravity it might have had in the mind. Upstairs, the air was colder. A bedroom faced the street, its curtains half drawn, the bed neatly made beneath a film of dust. On the dressing table stood a photograph frame turned face down. I left it that way. Sometimes it is better to meet a thing on your own terms, not when the day is already thick with first impressions. When we stepped back into the street, the rain had begun again, tapping lightly on the bonnet of the car. The neighbor had retreated indoors. I thought of the rattle on the mantelpiece, its absurd brightness in that stale room, and of the poem fragment in my pocket. Somewhere between the two, I suspected, the house was waiting to tell its story. Oxford, like most old cities, contains circles within circles, not all of them charitable. Caroline Fenton's was no exception, the kind that gathered at private viewings and faculty dinners, where wine was poured without generosity but with great ceremony, and conversation ran to books no one had quite finished reading. Lewis and I began with Dr. Adrian Vale. He received us in his rooms at St. Ethelwold's, surrounded by tall bookcases groaning with the usual mixture of Greek tragedians and contemporary literary criticism. He had the manner of a man accustomed to filling silence, his sentences strung with decorative clauses that concealed the absence of anything useful. Vale spoke of Caroline as one speaks of a colleague who had become, over time, a fixed point in the landscape, not quite friend, not quite rival. She had, he said, been a generous hostess, if occasionally too willing to embroider the truth for dramatic effect. As he ushered us out, he attempted a flourish of poetry, remarking that Caroline had been one to seek knowledge like a sword in the stone. I knew the line he meant, Tennyson's, but he had misplaced both the sword and the stone in the original. An academic slip, but one worth filing away. A man who misquotes in comfort may also misremember in convenience. Margot Ellison lived in a terraced house off the Iffley Road, her sitting room dominated by a cello case in one corner and the faint resin smell of bow hair. She was a woman of delicate bearing, the kind whose face is marked not by age, but by the weight of something long carried. Caroline had been kind to her, she said, when Margot's husband died unexpectedly. There was a rumor, I ventured, of her closeness to Vale. Margot's bow hand tightened imperceptibly. Vale, she replied, was a man in love with the sound of his own voice. She preferred quieter company. Hugh Copley was harder to track down, eventually located in the upper reading room of the Bodleian, peering at a vellum manuscript as if it might personally apologize for existing. A medieval historian with debts, Lewis had confirmed that much, and a reputation for acerbity. Copley spoke with precision, each word weighed as though careless language might corrode his credentials. Yes, he had known Caroline. No, he had not been inside the house on Canning Lane for many years. At this point, his gaze shifted, briefly but distinctly, to the window, a glance that said either he was searching for the right date or avoiding the wrong one. When pressed, he claimed the memory was not immediately at hand. It was a peculiar phrase. Memory, in my experience, either is or is not at hand. Its absence is rarely so neatly phrased. Rachel Fenton was last and least forthcoming. She met us in a small cafe near the station, her coffee growing cold while she dismantled a croissant into smaller and smaller pieces. Yes, Caroline was her mother. No, they were not close. No, she did not wish to elaborate. She asked if she could go. The words were polite, but the eyes not. I could see in her the inheritance of some of Caroline's features, though sharpened by something more defensive. There is a kind of silence people build like a wall, and Rachel's had been under construction for years. By evening, the day's conversations lay before me like 4 pieces from different puzzles. Vale's misquotation still troubled me, not for its academic sin, but for what it implied about the man's relationship with the truth. Margot's denial was too clean. Grief, in my experience, leaves smudges. Copley's hesitation when asked about the house was almost a reflex, a flinch of thought, and Rachel's refusal to speak of her mother, whether born of anger, shame, or something still more intricate, was the one certainty I felt I could trust. Lewis asked, over a pint at the Turf, if I thought one of them had killed her. I told him yes. But I did not say which one, because at that moment I didn't know. And, if I am honest, because I wanted them all to remain possible a little longer. Lewis arrived late that morning with the expression of a man who had been turning something over in his mind and finding the edges sharper each time. He waited until we were seated in Caroline Fenton's study before producing the file. The room itself was a small annex at the back of the house, lined with books that smelt faintly of mildew and dusted at a level that suggested habit rather than care. A typewriter sat on the desk beneath a green-shaded lamp, its ribbon half-wound and brittle. Lewis laid the papers flat, smoothing them with the side of his hand. Caroline had altered her will 3 months before her death. The original had been unremarkable. Her daughter, Rachel, sole beneficiary. The revision stripped Rachel's name entirely, replacing it with something Lewis read aloud without inflection, the Lachesis House Literary Trust. The name lingered unpleasantly in the air. Lachesis, the second of the three fates, the measurer of life's thread. I felt the old familiar itch when a classical allusion appears where it has no business. Lewis, unmoved by Greek mythology, remarked only that the trust seemed obscure to the point of invisibility. He had found no offices, no board members, just a postal box in Jericho and a bank account in the trust's name. I let him work through the inventory of her possessions while I drifted along the shelves, reading titles more by instinct than reason. The books spanned decades, a slow accumulation of intellectual strata. Romantic poetry, biographies of composers, the occasional textbook on child psychology. One volume, a slim history of Oxford's May Day celebrations, was wedged at an angle as though hastily replaced. Inside it, pressed between the pages, was a photograph. Sepia, the corner soft, the gloss dulled by time. May Day, circa 1974. Magdalen Tower blurred in the background, the crowd spilling across the high. The young Caroline was there, not centered but caught in the frame's edge, turning towards someone unseen. Her hair fell loose to her shoulders, and there was a brightness to her expression I had not encountered in death. Beside her, a pram. The hood was up. The baby's face turned just enough to be hidden from the camera. I kept the photograph in my hand longer than necessary. May Day mornings had always struck me as a curious mixture of renewal and regret. The music drifting down from the tower, the air still chilled from the night before, the faces turned upwards to something they half believed in. What had been in that pram, and why did I feel the same quiet resistance in myself as when first I'd seen the silver rattle? Lewis noticed the photograph and asked if it meant anything. I told him not yet, which was true. But I had the uneasy sense that the answer would find me whether I looked for it or not. Returning to the will, I traced the handwriting in the margins. Caroline's own notes, firm and deliberate. No hesitation in removing Rachel's name, no qualifying clauses. Whatever had passed between them was final enough to be recorded in legal ink. That, or she had reason to believe Rachel would be otherwise provided for. We left the study with little more than we had entered, save the knowledge that Caroline had chosen an anonymous trust over her only child, and that 40 years earlier she had been a young woman with a pram on May Day morning. These facts, unrelated at first glance, were beginning to collect in my mind like small stones in a pocket, their weight not yet bothersome, but noticeable. As we stepped into the street, the wind had shifted, carrying the smell of rain from the south. Lachesis, the measurer of life's thread. I found myself wondering not how Caroline's thread had been cut, but when she had first begun to measure it herself. It is a professional hazard, and a private pleasure, to feel the first shape of a theory coalesce in the mind, to sense the scattered pieces incline towards each other as though drawn by some quiet magnetism. For 2 days I had been nursing such a shape, and it was almost elegant. The Lachesis House Trust, obscure, unstaffed, with a postal box as its only address, seemed a perfect facade. The more I considered it, the more I saw the outlines of a scheme. Forged documents lodged in dusty files, a signature or two copied from letters now long burned, and beneath it all, Professor Hugh Copley's debts pressing against his better judgment. Caroline, perhaps having stumbled across the truth in the course of her literary interests, had found herself holding something sharper than she realized. She had altered her will, intending to confront Copley or expose him, and he had silenced her before she could. It fitted neatly. Too neatly. In my experience, a theory that closes upon itself with such satisfying finality rarely survives contact with the world beyond the mind. But I allowed myself the indulgence. I pictured the sequence of events, the quick anger, the fall on the stairs, the sound, perhaps, of that rattle set deliberately on the mantelpiece, a symbol or a warning no one else would decode. Lewis, bless him, found my construction plausible enough to warrant the administrative grind of confirming it. He applied for the necessary warrants, spoke to bank managers with the politeness I have never mastered, and returned 3 days later with a thin folder that might as well have been an epitaph to my theory. The trust was genuine, set up in 1978 by one Henry Colburn, poet, minor figure in the literary circles of his day, now some decades dead. The stated purpose: to fund emerging writers of promise, to preserve manuscripts otherwise in danger of neglect. No fraud, no missing funds, no artifice beyond the usual pretensions of the literary class. Colburn had left a modest estate and a series of endowments. The accounts were intact, the trustees legitimate, and Copley's name nowhere near the paper trail. It is not easy to be disabused of one's neatest ideas, but Lewis insisted on doing it over pints at the King's Arms, which softened the blow. He let me have the first sip before delivering the final, incontrovertible fact. Caroline Fenton had been a trustee herself for nearly 20 years. There was no sign she had ever sought to profit from the role. If anything, she had donated to the trust in the past. I told Lewis, truthfully, that this left me with very little. He replied, truthfully, that we still had the photograph, the neighbors' stories of music and lights, and 4 people who seemed to know more than they were willing to say. That night, alone, I poured myself a whiskey instead of Rioja and laid the photograph on the table. The young Caroline's half-turned face seemed to contain a brightness foreign to the woman I'd seen on the floor of that drawing room. The pram beside her was an ordinary thing, collapsible, canvas hood raised against the May morning chill. But the baby's face, hidden, almost deliberately turned from the lens, was what kept my mind circling the image. It is a habit I cannot break, to look not only at what a photograph shows, but at what it refuses to. And here the refusal was absolute. A woman with no known small children in 1974, standing beside a pram on May Day, a baby whose face would not be seen. If the trust had no fraud to hide, perhaps the photograph did. I left the whiskey unfinished. Some puzzles cannot be approached directly. They must be allowed to turn in the dark for a while, until the shape they make can be seen without the distraction of light. Do you want me to proceed into Chapter 6, the letter in the library? 700 words, in the same restrained first-person Morse voice. The Bodleian has its own kind of hush. Not silence exactly, but a sound composed of turned pages, the slow exhalations of scholars, and the faint, dry rustle of centuries in paper form. It is the sort of place that makes even the least superstitious person conscious of ghosts. I signed the request slip in my usual untidy hand and passed it to the desk. Colburn, Henry, manuscripts and correspondence. The archivist, a young man in an overstarched collar, looked as though I'd asked for the original Magna Carta, but he nodded and vanished into the stacks. When the box arrived, I took it to a seat by the far wall. The papers had the faint smell of long-shut rooms, dust, ink, a trace of tobacco. There were the usual things. Drafts of poems with the careful crossings out of a man who doubted every second word. Letters to editors pleading for advances. The occasional unpaid bill. It was inside a first edition of his collected poems, 1976, that I found the envelope. No address. The paper was the cheap lined sort one buys in a hurry, the ink a faded blue. I unfolded it with the delicacy of a bomb, disposal officer, half expecting it to disintegrate in my hands. Caroline, the little one in the house on Canning Lane, is not forgotten. She is yours more than you think. Protect her from the pieties of others and from your own impulse to deny. Truth is the only heir worth protecting. The rest will pass with us. H.C. The words left a faint pressure in the air around me, as though Colburn had stepped momentarily back into the room to see how I would take them. The little one. A pram. May Day. 1974. And the word carried all the weight of Caroline's altered will, the excision of her own daughter, the gift to Lachesis' house. I was still reading the letter a third time when the sound of a chair scraping caught my ear. Margot Ellison, hair swept back, cello case strap slung across her shoulder, was standing 2 tables away, a sheaf of music manuscripts under one arm. She had the slightly guilty look of someone who had found a police inspector where she expected only students. "Inspector," she said, her voice low, as though afraid to wake the books, "I didn't know you were—" She broke off, the sentence discarded in favor of a small, tight smile. I closed the Colburn volume a fraction too quickly, but her eyes had already drifted to the box of papers in front of me. Musicians are trained to notice rhythm, and there was a rhythm in her glance. Brief, assessing, quickly withdrawn. "Looking for inspiration?" she asked. "Always," I said. "And you?" She tapped the manuscripts in her arm. "Bach, safer company than most people I know." Then, with a slight nod, she moved towards the exit. It would have been unremarkable, but for the hesitation, half a heartbeat, when her gaze met mine after I mentioned Colburn's name in passing. A flicker, nothing more, but enough for me to file away. Surprise at seeing me was one thing. Surprise at the name of a poet dead for 20 years was another. When she was gone, I opened the letter again. Canning Lane was a narrow street north of the canal, hardly more than a run of terraced houses and a corner shop. I could not recall Caroline ever having lived there, but Oxford has a way of concealing its past in plain sight. I copied the letter by hand before returning it to its makeshift hiding place in Colburn's poems. For the moment, I wanted its existence to remain unremarked. There is an advantage in knowing something your subjects do not realize you know. The archivist gave me a courteous nod as I left. Outside, the air had the thin chill of early evening, and the tower of the Radcliffe camera glowed faintly gold. Somewhere, in the half-lit stacks of the Bodleian, Henry Colburn was still keeping a promise, and I was beginning to suspect that promises, like wills, are rarely altered without consequence. Margot didn't come to the station. She insisted we meet at her flat, top floor of a Victorian conversion on Banbury Road, the sort of place whose skirting boards had been painted over so many times they'd lost all definition. She answered the door in a shawl the color of weak tea, hair loose, eyes that registered both caution and fatigue. "You've been avoiding me," I said. She smiled faintly. "Avoiding questions, Inspector. Not quite the same thing." Inside, the air was warm with the smell of oolong and dust. A cello leaned against the wall by the window, a stack of unpaid bills acting as an improvised music stand. She poured tea without asking and waited for me to speak. "Margot, the night Caroline died, where were you?" Her fingers tapped once on the porcelain cup. "I was at her house." I let the pause stretch. "Why?" "I'd been putting it off for weeks," she said, eyes down. "The Canning Lane place. It's worthless, really, but selling it might have cleared what I owe. Caroline knew about the bills, the treatment. I thought she might be persuaded." "You were asking for money?" "For help," she corrected with a small lift of the chin. "I thought she might see it as tying off loose ends. I didn't expect—" Her voice trailed, and for a moment she looked smaller, diminished. "What happened?" We argued. She said the house wasn't hers to sell. I accused her of being selfish. She laughed, a short, cold laugh, and turned away. I reached for her arm. She stumbled, hit the sideboard. It wasn't hard, not really, but she went down. I panicked. When I realized she was gone, I made it look as if she'd simply fallen asleep in the chair. I didn't want the police thinking that you'd killed her. I finished. She didn't answer. It fitted at first. A desperate woman, a quarrel over money, a sudden death tidied into something natural. Neat as crimes go, if crimes can be neat. And Margot's eyes, though damp at the edges, held a steadiness that suggested she'd made peace with the confession. Later, in the coroner's office, the smell of disinfectant undercut by something metallic, I laid out what she'd told me. The coroner, a man with the perpetually amused expression of one who has seen too much, listened without comment until I'd finished. "Plausible," he said, "except for the time of death. How wrong am I? Hours, at least 4 before your cellist friend claims to have arrived. The injury, a subdural hematoma from a blow to the temple, occurred well before she set foot in that room. She may have found the body, but she didn't cause it." The theory collapsed in my head like a badly built stage set, leaving the bare boards of fact beneath. I thanked him, though the word came out with the dryness of chalk. Walking back along the High, the city felt suddenly altered. The stone colleges watchful, the bells of St. Mary's marking time I hadn't kept. Margot had lied, but not in the way I thought. She'd given me a false confession, and false confessions are as instructive as the truth, if you know how to read them. In the Randolph bar that evening, Lewis arrived late and found me staring at a half-drunk pint. "Something wrong with it, sir?" he asked. "Only the taste of wasted effort." I told him briefly about the timing. He frowned. "So if she didn't kill her, then either she's protecting someone," I said, "or she's hiding something else entirely." "And the house?" I shook my head. "The house is still at the center of it. Canning Lane, a baby in a pram, a will that cuts out the obvious heir, and somewhere in the middle, Henry Colburn whispering from his grave." Lewis gave me the look he reserves for moments when I drift into the poetic. I drained the pint, tasting nothing at all. The scrap of paper had been sitting on my desk for days, anchored beneath the empty pint glass I'd brought home from the pub, as though ale residue could keep meaning from evaporating. It was just 4 lines, untitled, in Colburn's familiar hand, though never published in any collection. I'd skimmed it 6 times without seeing past the obvious. A meditation on winter light through a nursery window. Pleasant enough, but hardly the sort of thing to accompany a body. That night, too late for coffee, too early for sleep. I took it up again. A draft hissed through the sash frame, rustling the paper so it almost seemed to whisper. My eyes tracked the lines, then snagged. The spacing. Colburn's hand was neat, almost calligraphic, yet here and there a gap stretched wider than it ought. Not so wide as to jar, just enough to plant unease in the back of the mind. First in the first line, then the second, and so on. I reached for a pencil and began noting the first letter after each odd space. At first it produced a mess, the beginning of words, abrupt consonants. But by the third pass, shifting which gaps I counted, a shape emerged. Rachelssoni, said it aloud. Rachel's son. The words sat in the room like an unexpected guest. I leaned back, the chair protesting, and let the connections spool out. Rachel, Caroline's younger sister, dead in 1974 after what the papers had politely called a brief illness. She'd been unmarried, living abroad for a year before her death. The funeral notices had been brisk, almost perfunctory. And the baby I'd been circling in every theory, the one in the pram from that old photograph. Not Caroline's, perhaps, but Rachel's. Raised quietly by her elder sister to avoid the stink of scandal. No adoption records, no guardianship papers. Just a child who belonged to Caroline from the moment she stepped off the train. I went to the bookshelf and pulled Colburn's collected works, thumbing through the annotated pages I'd already seen in the Bodleian. His letters to Caroline were always formal, courtly, except for that one in the library, speaking of the little one as though protecting him were an act of holy duty. If the trust was genuine, as the audit had proved, then perhaps it wasn't meant for Caroline at all. Perhaps Colburn had set it up for the boy, Rachel's son, with Caroline as the careful steward. A new question wormed its way in. Where was he now? I thought of the laughter in the Canning Lane house. Lewis had said it sounded wrong, like it was coming off a telly. At the time, I'd filed that under background noise. Now, I pictured it as bait. A looped recording, just loud enough to drift into the street, a sound designed to draw Caroline, or someone else, to the door. Someone who knew the truth might have been lured in exactly that way. I spread the photographs across the desk. The pram in the garden, Carolyn at 27, Colburn with his poet's scowl. In the far corner of one print, blurred and almost lost in shadow, was the edge of a child's shoe. Too small for Caroline, too new for a charity shop find. A cold certainty began to settle. Whoever had staged the scene at Canning Lane knew the history. The child, the trust, the carefully buried link between Rachel and the boy she left behind. And now they were shaking it loose. At 1:30 I rang Lewis. He answered on the third grumble. "This had better be about the case, sir." "It is. Find me everything we've got on Rachel Ellison, friends, employers, the lot, and track down parish records from 74. Christenings, naming ceremonies, anything." He yawned audibly. "And if I find her son?" "Then," I said, "we ask him why someone is still playing his mother's lullabies." The line clicked dead, leaving me with the whisper of the draft and Colburn's paper between my fingers, the gaps in the ink now as wide as the years they'd been meant to conceal. The Cherwell flows through Oxford with a gentle patience, bending around willows that drip their fingers into the water, as if reluctant to disturb its slow course. I met Rachel by the old stone bridge, where the river's voice mingled with the city's distant hum. The sky was low and grey, the kind that presses down without quite falling. She arrived quietly, the same guarded expression I'd seen in the cafe, though now edged with a brittle weariness. We walked along the towpath, the gravel crunching underfoot, and I let the silence stretch, as one does when words feel more like trespass than communication. Finally, I spoke obliquely, as if testing the air for its truth before fully entering. I mentioned the photograph, the May Day crowd, the pram beside Caroline, and the trust she had established. The name Lachesis, I said, carrying the weight of the ancient fate who measured life's thread. "You must know," I said, "that inheritance law would have given any child of yours a claim to that estate, regardless of a will's wishes, especially one hidden so carefully." She stopped, turning her gaze to the river where the water blurred reflections into something mutable and fragile. Her voice was low. "There was a child. My child." The admission hung between us, fragile as the ripples at our feet. "He was adopted," she continued, "when I was still young. The circumstances, well, you can imagine how things were then. Scandal would have been ruin." I nodded, though my mind was already racing ahead. "Have you seen him since?" Her eyes tightened, a shadow crossing the line of her mouth. "I only recently learned who he is." The name came then, tentative but clear. Adrian Vale. I did not speak for a moment. The pieces I'd been tracing, the faded trust, the pram in the photograph, the letter from Colburn, all suddenly fell into a new, sharper focus. Vale, the man with the misquoted poetry and the fading career, was not just another suspect but the missing link in a family neither had acknowledged. "Did you tell him?" I asked finally. "No," she said, "not yet." "He went to the house, didn't he?" "To Canning Lane." She looked away, the first flicker of shame or fear or something deeper. "Yes, to speak with Caroline, to understand. But it ended badly. A quarrel, sudden, fierce. The accident was unintentional." I could imagine it. Two people, bound by blood and silence, unraveling in a room filled with dust and secrets. "It changes things," I said quietly, more than I expected. She nodded, stepping closer to the railing. Below, the water slid past, uncaring. "It explains the laughter," I said. "The echo you heard that rainy afternoon. It might have been a recording, a lure to bring him back." Rachel's face was unreadable, but I sensed relief, or perhaps only resignation. Our walk ended with no promises, no declarations, only the slow murmur of the chair-well and the weight of long-buried truths now lifted to the surface. As I watched her disappear down the path, I felt the faint stirrings of both resolution and regret, knowing the case was far from over, but that a new chapter had begun. The abandoned house on Canning Lane wore its silence like a shroud, each creak of floorboard and whisper of draught seeming to carry the weight of secrets long confined. I arranged for Vale to come under the pretense of discussing the estate, one final private conversation before the matter concluded. The dusk settled like a soft curtain as I waited with Lewis in the dim drawing room where Caroline had taken her last breath. Vale arrived with the hesitance of a man who carried unseen burdens, his eyes flickering to the silver rattle still resting on the mantelpiece, immaculate among the dust and decay. He had aged since our first meeting, the charm faded, replaced by a brittle, restless energy. I could see the lines carved by regret and the slow erosion of hope. The conversation began cautiously. I spoke of the trust, of inheritance, of shadows that refused to lift. I watched as he struggled to maintain a mask, the habitual eloquence faltering. Eventually, the dam broke. He recounted the night in a voice low and raw, a tale of confrontation, denial, and sudden violence. Caroline had refused to acknowledge him as her grandson's father. The rage that followed was less about anger and more about a grief too sharp to contain. He said he had reached out, hoping for recognition, and she had shoved him away, harder than she intended. There was a scuffle, a moment lost to time, and then the sickening sound of her fall. I listened without interruption, the room holding its breath alongside me. Vale spoke of the cassette tape, the baby's laughter, recorded and preserved by Caroline as a last tether to joy, a fragile echo of innocence lost. It had been set to play quietly through the old speakers, a sound meant to comfort herself, but which had drifted beyond the walls, haunting the empty house. Lewis stepped forward quietly, the formalities of arrest unfolding without fanfare. Vale offered no resistance, his resignation palpable. There was no spectacle, no dramatic confession shouted into the night, only a quiet acceptance of the consequences long simmering beneath his skin. As they led him away, I remained behind, staring at the silver rattle and the fading light that slanted through the cracked window panes. The house seemed to exhale, as if relieved to shed its burden. The case had closed, but the ache lingered. An old wound reopened and only partially healed. The quads of Oxford in the evening hold their breath beneath a sky smeared with bruised violet clouds, the fading light washing the stone facades in a melancholy glaze. Walking alone, I traced the echoes of the case. Caroline's will, the quiet betrayals, the fragile intersections of grief and pride that had shaped so much. Lachesis, the measurer of life's thread, haunted the edges of my thoughts. Caroline's decision to cut her daughter from her will, the secret child raised in silence, the tangled connections forged and severed in shadows. Fate, it seemed, was both cruel and capricious, weaving patterns that only revealed their meaning in hindsight. The case had closed, but the threads remained knotted, the endings uneasy. I found myself wondering if Rachel would ever forgive Adrian Vale, a man shaped as much by absence as by the weight of his own failings, or if the revelation would deepen the wounds she carried. Returning to the Bodleian, I placed the letter from Colburn back within the volume of his collected poems. The pages whispered faintly, as if stirred by some unseen breath. I lingered over one line, underlined in a careful hand. The thread is cut, but the spindle still turns. A paradox befitting a city where past and present entwine endlessly. where every stone bears witness to stories half remembered and half forgotten. As I stepped back into the drizzle, the smell of damp paper and wet stone clinging to the air, I felt the ache that comes from knowing that some truths offer no relief, only a sharper understanding of loss. Oxford, for all its grandeur, remains a place where the quiet tragedies of ordinary lives play out beneath the watchful gaze of its spires, and where the thread of one life story can unravel slowly, measured by hands unseen. Weeks had passed since the last footsteps fell heavy across the creaking floorboards of the Canning Lane house. Now the place sat shuttered and silent, its windows obscured by rough boards, the peeling wallpaper hidden beneath a new layer of dust and shadow. The street carried on around it, indifferent to the stories woven into its walls, as if the house itself were a silent relic, forgotten in the steady hum of Oxford life. I passed by one evening, the air thick with mist curling low over the cobbles, the chill pressing through my coat like a whispered warning. The lamps along the street cast pools of orange light, fragmented by the rising fog. The house loomed at the corner, dark and still, an absence in the fabric of the city. For a moment, brief and fleeting like a trick of the fog or the half-remembered pulse of memory, I thought I heard it. A child's giggle, clear, bright and impossible. It echoed softly from the sealed rooms, rising and falling with the sighing wind. I stopped, muscles taut, eyes fixed on the boarded windows as if expecting the sound to speak again. But the street remained still. No footsteps, no shadow, only the faint rustle of leaves in the gutter and the distant toll of a bell marking the hour. I did not investigate further. Some echoes, I've learned over the years, are better left unpursued. They linger in the spaces between fact and forgetting, in the corners where grief and hope quietly collide. Turning away, I pulled my collar tighter against the damp and started walking. The mist curled around me, soft and unrelenting, as Oxford's ancient stones seemed to lean in closer, listening. In this city, even silence remembers.